Okay, the topic today is what we call the Haredi community or the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, and also the modern Orthodox Jewish community. Um, Outside of Israel, you don't have too many types of Orthodoxy. You have ultra-Orthodox and you have modern Orthodox. In Israel, you have many variations. The reason is because in Israel, the reform and the conservative movements are not strong. I'll have to explain that, maybe not today, but it's because Israeli society is very, even though it doesn't always seem so, it is very conservative and very traditional. I say it doesn't always seem so because many of the Jews that you will meet in Romania don't seem so. But that's just the way the world works, right? But Israeli society is probably the most traditional Jewish society on the planet, where the vast majority of the Jews observe the kosher laws. And that's the main reason why most of the supermarkets are kosher in Israel. When I say most, I mean 90%, probably 95%. It's just a consumer issue. I always say that economics doesn't lie. In politics you can lie, but economics never lies. So that's why it's always interesting to look at things from an economic point of view, because then you understand what's actually going on. And I would say about 30 years ago, I used to go to Tiberias a lot. I just liked the city. It was a bit far, but they have the one lake. We have one lake in Israel. So and I remember one or two times that I was there on Passover, most of the restaurants were not kosher for Passover in Tiberias. But as the years went on and the tourism demanded kosher products, today all the restaurants open in Tiberias on Passover are kosher for Passover. It's just a matter of consumer desires, and that's exactly what happened. So when you don't mix politics in, consumerism does its own. It works quite well, actually, in that way. So let me there are other reasons why there aren't a lot of reform and conservative in Israel. One of the main reasons I would say is because in Israel, you're either religious or you're secular. You understand what I'm saying? So it's not, people don't think, people who are secular Jews don't think, well, maybe I should be reform or conservative. That doesn't occur to them. But there's more to say about that, but I will leave that for a little bit later. Ben Gurion once said, the synagogue that I don't pray in is Orthodox. If you understand what I'm saying. It's a famous statement by David Ben Gurion. And it says a lot about Israeli society, which means that he himself is not an observant Jew, but he saw Judaism as Orthodox. Anyhow, let's get back to this. What is Orthodoxy? What does it mean? I know you have the term Orthodox, of course, in Romania about Christianity, but what does it mean in Judaism, Orthodox? Well, Orthodox, of course, literally means somebody who believes in the straight path. That's what literally it means. They don't want to veer off right and left. But how do you define what orthodoxy is? The term orthodoxy, of course, is a term from the 19th century. It is the Reform Jews who referred to the observant Jews as Orthodox. It was not the Orthodox Jews who called themselves Orthodox. It was the Reform Jews who referred to the Jews who were not Reform as Orthodox. Now, by the 20th century, Orthodox Jews were already referring to themselves as Orthodox, but it didn't begin that way. Because before the 19th century, most Jews were traditional. there weren't a lot of, people are people and they have different views, but most Jews were traditional. And the way it worked was, if you were more close to these things, you would keep more. If you were less close, you kept less. But more or less everybody kept within the fold. So everybody more or less, followed the customs and the kashrut laws and the Sabbath, etc. Whether more or less, but in general, yes. This is how it was in Ashkenazic Jewish societies. This is how it was in Mizrahic Jewish societies, in Sephardi, in Iraq, in Persia, etc. Before the emancipation. Jews were, I would say, more or less traditionalists. When the emancipation created individualism, which means, as I said before, you now have a passport and you can now relate to the state that you're living in directly as an individual. As I said, the first reaction was assimilation. Jews who left Judaism, specifically in Germany, and this assimilation brought about Jews who wanted to also become part of the religion of that society. In Germany, it was a Protestantism. In France, it was Catholicism. In England, it was Anglicanism. But Jews wanted to become part of the society. That was the first movement. Then, of course, you had the Reform, those who tried to create a Judaism which was slightly watered down for Jews to say, you don't have to move out. We can make something more liberal that you can be proud of. And then, of course, you have, in Germany, I mentioned the Modern Orthodox with Samuel Raphael Hirsch, who, on the one hand, wanted to embrace the New World with emancipation, to embrace secular knowledge and the sciences, but to remain steadfast to Judaism. Because Samson Raphael Hirsch is the first reactionary to Reform, I'm going to use him as a model, even if this model is not shared in every country. What does it mean to be an Orthodox Jew today? And this is probably correct in the 19th century as well. It basically means that you hold the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, as being the basic description of what Judaism is. The Code of Jewish Law was written in the 16th century. It is a summary of Talmudic law written by, on the one hand, Joseph Caro, who is a Jew who was banished from Spain in the expulsion of 1492. And he was the first, one of two authors of the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch literally means the table that was set. The table that was set. How do you say that in Romanian, to set the table? You have to unmute yourself, Monica.
A pune masa.
Pregătirea mesei, aranjarea.
Right, so you're sort of setting the table. Now all you have to do is eat. So the Code of Jewish Law is actually called Shulchan Aruch, setting the table which I set. The main author is Joseph Caro, who was actually a famous legalist and Kabbalist from Tzfat in the 16th century, the city of Safed. As I said, who is one of those who survived the expulsion of Spain. And the second author of the same book was Moses Isserlich, Rabbi Moses Isserlich, who lives in Krakow. And when he hears that Joseph Caro wrote his Code of Jewish Law, he decides to write a glossary on it, his comments. Today, the Code of Jewish Law has both. It has Joseph Caro's ideas in block letters, in bold, and you have in italics, you have the opinions of Moses Isserlich. Moses Isserlich comments when Ashkenazic custom differs from the customs of the Sephardim and the North Africans. You see, Joseph Caro based his Code of Jewish Law on three people, on three famous books. One of them was Maimonides, in his book on Jewish law called Mishneh Torah. The second one was Asher ben Yechiel, who lived in Germany, but then actually moved to Spain at the end of his life. But he did live in the areas of Germany in the 14th century. And also Isaac Alfasi, who lived in Morocco in the 12th century. So every time 2 out of 3 agreed, Joseph Caro made this the law. Sort of like you have a Beit Din, you have a tribunal of 3 judges. Whenever 2 out of 3 agree, that's the law. And that's exactly how he built his Shulchan Aruch. The problem was, of course, that when you have 3 judges, one from North Africa, one from Spain, and one from Germany, the Ashkenazic custom becomes secondary because you have 2 out of 3 who are not Ashkenazic. That's why Moses Isserlich felt it was important to write on the Shulchan Aruch wherever the Ashkenazic custom differs. To this day, the Ashkenazic Jews follow the Code of Jewish Law, and they follow Moses Isserlich's comments. Jews from Sephardic Jews more or less follow the Code of Jewish Law according to Joseph Caro. I say more or less because it's slightly complicated explanation, because Sephardic communities saw the Code of Jewish Law different than Ashkenazi communities did. In general, Eastern Jews saw the Code of Jewish Law as an important work, but not the last cry. Okay, but not as binding as Ashkenazi Jews saw it. Let me put it that way. Local custom was very important to Jews who lived in North Africa, in Iraq, in Persia. Local custom was very important to them. So where their personal local customs differed with the Code of Jewish Law, they followed their local custom. Ashkenazic Jews also had local custom, but I would say the Code of Jewish Law was really 90% of the time the way they saw Orthodox Judaism. So this Code of Jewish Law from the 16th century really becomes a sort of description of Orthodoxy, meaning how a Jew is supposed to live their life, what type of commandments, what type of customs, how you keep the holidays and the dietary laws and the Sabbath, etc. The interesting thing is, in the Code of Jewish Law, there's no discussion on what you're supposed to believe, which is very interesting because in most religions, their main fights were about ideas. The Catholics fought the Protestants in France for years over ideas. But the Shiites and the Sunnis fought each other also for years, probably even till today. But over ideas. Jews never fought each other over ideas. It was only about practical stuff. So if a Jew kept the Sabbath, but he had strange ideas, nobody paid attention. If he wrote a book about the strange ideas, yes, then somebody would say something. But as long as he didn't write a book, or she, then it didn't bother anybody. Because, you have to draw the line of what's important for the community. Because always people have unusual ideas. Okay, so that's how I'm going to define orthodoxy. Orthodoxy I'm going to define as a relationship to Jewish law, where it sees Jewish law as an obligation, a divine obligation, because God gave the Torah. And it's more or less depicted in this Code of Jewish Law of the 16th century with the discussions that follow after that and the applications in modern society. And there's much literature which follows the Code of Jewish Law. Yes. Oh, by the way, I'm just going to pause for a moment. And
no, a little more.
Okay.
It's not so clear for me. If you like, please.
I would say Orthodox Judaism, first and foremost, relates to practice. It's not that Jews don't have a belief, we do. But you never know what people think because it's in their head. So it's sometimes sometimes beliefs are just assumed, I would say. For instance, Maimonides talks about 13 principles of faith in Judaism, which is probably accepted by all Orthodox Jews. I can read to you the 13 principles of faith. If we're talking about that, let me show it to you right now. Let's find it, 13 principles of faith. Okay, we'll do it like this. When I say that there are 13 principles of faith, it doesn't mean there aren't some discrepancies, but it's very accepted, Maimonides' definition. Here, can you see this? These are the 13 principles of faith of Maimonides in a nutshell. He talks more about this. Number one, believe in the existence of the Creator, who is perfect in every matter of existence and is the primary cause of all that exists. Okay, that's number one. Number two, the belief in God's absolute and unparalleled unity. God is one, which means there is no other. Number three, God is non-corporeal. He has no body and no picture. He's not affected by anything physical, neither movement nor rest nor dwelling. God is eternal. Okay, so as you can see, the first four have to do with belief in God. I'm talking about, this is Maimonides' 12th century 13 principles of Judaism. Because remember, there's nowhere before this where it actually says there are principles in Judaism as far as belief. So Maimonides tries to summarize the way he understands it. Number five, it's imperative to worship God, prayer, not any foreign false gods. You can only worship God and no other God. Number six, God communicates with human beings through prophecy. Of course, we believe that prophecy is only at certain times. Our last prophet was the prophet Malachi. God can communicate with human beings through prophecy. So already up to six, it still has to do with things that have to do with beliefs in God. Number seven, belief in the primacy of the prophecies of Moses, our teacher. And Moses is the greatest prophet. And therefore, no other prophet can dispute what Moses brought. That's also our belief. Number eight, we believe that the Torah is divine origin, that God gave the Torah to Moses, and not that Moses just wrote it by himself. Number nine, we believe in the immutability of the Torah, meaning the Torah will never change. That the basic ideas of the Torah will never change. But the application of the Torah, meaning society changes, so the application could change, but the Torah itself does not. Number 10, we believe in God's providence and omniscience, meaning God knows all, and also cares about human beings. That's divine providence. He's interested in what goes on in this world. Number 11, we believe in divine reward and retribution. God rewards and punishes. Number 12, we believe in the coming of the Messianic era. Number 13, we believe in the resurrection of the dead. All these have to be clarified. I'm just saying these are the 13 principles. You can find them on Wikipedia. Now, all Orthodox Jews believe in these 13 principles, by the way. There are discussions of what some of the things mean, like what is the resurrection of the dead? What is the Messianic era? There are very involved discussions among Jewish thinkers. But, okay, so that was just to clarify from faith point of view, what Jews believe in. But very often orthodoxy was seen through the eyes of the practical. Remember, in Judaism, there are many commandments. We have 613 commandments. In addition, there are rabbinic decrees and enactments So now, even though there are 613 commandments, you don't do them all the time. Some of the commandments only are connected to the festival of Passover, like eating the unleavened bread. Some of them only are connected to other holidays. Some of them are only happen when the temple is built. Some of them only happen in the land of Israel. Some of them only happen on the sabbatical year, which is once every 7 years. Right? So, I mean, Maimonides writes that on any given day, there are anywhere between 30 and 40 out of the 613, because they don't all apply on every day of the calendar. Some are only on the Sabbath. So I just wanted to point that out. But as I said, so Orthodoxy is both belief in the 13 principles and belief in the obligation of the mitzvot. The mitzvot, the commandments which are specific in the Torah, and also according to the way our tradition was explained through the rabbis in the after the Second Temple period, during and after, which is really the classical period of Judaism, the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, and the time of the Talmud. Is that clear? Is that okay? Somebody asked before. Okay.
Kirill asked, Mr. Shuhat, just a second. Two colleagues just came. So Ilana and Olympia are here.
Okay.
Thank
Very
you.
good. One moment. Olympia, I see. Which one? Which Ilana?
Ilana Velicu.
Velicu, yes. Okay. Very good.
Mulțumesc frumos.
So I hope I clarified that. Are there more questions about that, or did I do a good job? Or anything? Okay. So basically, as I said, bottom line, Orthodox Jews believe in the obligation of the Torah, the divine origin of the Torah, the obligation of the mitzvot, the way they were explained in our tradition. We even follow customs and rabbinic edicts, things that were fences around the law, which were developed over the centuries. People are people, of course. You know, somebody can say I'm an Orthodox Jew, but they look like they're keeping a little bit less than the other guy, because people are people. But I'm just saying, in general, that's what the Orthodox Jews believe. By the way, this is the same whether you are modern Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox. It's the same code of Jewish law. The differences between modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, a lot of them are social. And we'll talk about that later. And there are also certain issues. The three issues I would say today, which differentiate between the modern Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox, relationship to modernity. Is modernity good or bad? Modern Orthodox have no problems with modernity, even if it presents a challenge. Orthodoxy, the ultra-Orthodox would like to see their children grow up like their grandparents. If you understand what I'm saying. In other words, they don't take well to change. That's why they're like living in more insular neighborhoods and dressing a little bit differently. But this is a social difference. But the social difference comes with a fear of modernity. This fear of modernity, by the way, started in the emancipation. So ultra-Orthodoxy is also a reaction to the emancipation. Diana, did you want to ask something? I see the hand is up.
Yes, if I may, just to be everything clear. So if we are thinking about ultra Orthodox and modern Orthodox, you consider yourself modern Orthodox, right?
I do, but I haven't explained what it means yet. I am modern Orthodox in the sense that I am Orthodox and I see modernity as bringing many positive things. And of course, there are also things that are challenges, of course. But we live in a world that you have to deal with challenges. If you sweep them under the carpet, then it becomes worse.
In the same time, I think at least in Israel, it's very easy to recognize, especially in Jerusalem, the ultra-Orthodox, as they are wearing specific clothes. And not only that, they keep the religious laws and traditions, as you see them going before the Shabbat to enter with the wives, that they are also wearing specific clothes, and with many kids to the kotel to pray. But in the same time, the social behavior is different even on the street. So as far as I know, for some of them, probably the ones that are not married, I don't want to do any mistake, it's not even allowed to raise their eyes when they are close on the street to a woman, whether they are throwing with stones or screaming Shabbat, Shabbat to the cars driving.
Yeah, there's less of that
in
today, by
Shabbat.
the way.
Yes,
Yeah, less of
this
that.
was only a few years, not so long ago, but
Oh, really?
it's
Okay.
obviously, I mean, it's easy to identify them on the street.
Yeah, I have to say that the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community is not all the same. For instance, you have major differences between the Hasidic groups and what we call the mitnagdim, the ones who oppose the Hasidim, which today in Israel, instead of calling them those who oppose the Hasidim, they refer to them as the Lithuanian Jews, the Litvaks. Even though they probably were not born in Lithuania, but I'm just saying that's the way they refer to them in Israel. You have the ultra-Orthodox. Oh, what is the word mitzvah? Mitzvah, we translate it into English commandment. Commandment. In Hebrew, mitzvah comes from the word tzivui, which means to command. There's an interesting interpretation by David ben Zimra, who was the chief rabbi of Egypt in the 16th century, where he says if the word mitzvah does come from the word tzivui, which means command, but it also comes from the Hebrew word tzevet, which means a group, to be connected. It says because you keep God's commandment because you want the connection. That's Rabbi David ben Zimra, 16th century. Okay, so that's the word mitzvah, no problem. But what else? Oh yeah, so you have Hasidic Jews and you have, now the Hasidic Jews and the non-Hasidic Jews, this predates the emancipation. I can mention a little bit about it. There's a lot to say, but I'll mention just a little bit about it. The Hasidic movement starts with the name of an individual called Israel ben Eliezer Baal Shem, who is referred to as the Baal Shem Tov, which literally means the man of the good name. However, the term in Hebrew Baal Shem doesn't mean the man of the name. That's just the way they translate it. It means a master of the knowledge of names of God. It's a Kabbalistic term. There are others who had that name. A Baal Shem is somebody who knows the meaning of the different names of God and how to use them in techniques, in mystical techniques, which is sometimes called yichudim, unifying the names. And some of them use in techniques, ecstatic techniques of astral ascent, trying to feel yourself go up to the heavens. Which is very interesting because how does this connect to the Hasidic movement? It doesn't directly. The Baal Shem Tov is born in 1700. He lives in a city called Medjibish in Podolia. Podolia was in southern Poland, today the Ukraine. It was the Lithuanian-Polish Empire. And he dies in 1760. Israel ben Eliezer, Israel. He was not the rabbi of Medjibish. There was a rabbi of the little town of Medjibish. Wasn't him. We know very little about the person himself. Professor Moshe Roseman from my university, emeritus. So he found it in the archive in Krakow of the barons who controlled the land of Podolia in the 18th century. There are archives there of the city tax of all the lands where this family, whose name was Czartoryskish or something like that, owned the land which was given to them by the king. And there's also a list during the 2 years when the Baal Shem Tov lived in Medjugorje. There is a list there of who paid city tax among the Jewish community. And he is mentioned in one of the years. It says Israel Baal Shem Doctor in the first line. And then it says that he is exempt from the tax, meaning that's some type of position. And because he has official position, he was exempted from the city tax. And the second time it says Israel Baal Shem Kabbalist. And again it says that he was exempted from the city tax. The interesting thing about this is, how did they understand this term? Why did they call it one time doctor and another time Kabbalist? It appears that whoever was writing this presented the Baal Shem, or maybe the Polish people were writing it. They understood he's some type of medicine man, we would call it, like in the Indians. Maybe he knew herbal medicines, but he was like a mystical person too. So one time they call him doctor, one time they call him Kabbalist, which is interesting. It's one of the, because we don't have a lot of documentation about the historical Baal Shem. This is one of the, so it was interesting to see that. The Baal Shem Tov has people who come close to him, his students. He has about 10 of them. People who were interested in him actually because they were scholars of Judaism, but were not very familiar with anybody who had techniques in the 18th century of how to experience spiritual revelations. Not saying prophecy, I'm just saying something. So these people were very, very interested in what he had to say. And he had a small group that he used to spend time with and talk to them. We don't know a lot about what they discussed. We only know what they wrote. The first book that was published of Hasidic writings was published by Yaakov Yosef of Polna in 1780, the book Toldot Yaakov Yosef. There, he also has a letter that he received from the Baal Shem Tov, which is very important, that letter, because again, we have little information about the biography of the Baal Shem Tov, and this letter is a real letter, which he was holding on to. You see, the Baal Shem Tov's brother-in-law, Gershon of Kutov, had made Aliyah to Israel, which at that time was under the Ottoman Empire. And the Baal Shem Tov sent him a letter, and he gave it to Yaakov Yosef of Polna, who was supposed to be going to visit Jerusalem. It was actually in Tiberias, but he never went, and he kept the letter. In the meantime, in 1760, the Baal Shem Tov passed away. In 1780, he published it together with his book. The letter is fascinating because in this letter, he describes mystical experiences that he had. You might be able to find it online, come to think of it, and show you this. It's a letter of the Baal Shem Tov, his brother-in-law. Even if you can see just a little bit of it, I think it would be, you might be able to find it here. So, let's see. Letter of the Baal Shem Tov. Okay, here it is. Oh, no, that's not good. This one's in Hebrew. Let's see if I can get it in English. Oh. Is that it? I got it. Okay, very good. So, one moment. This is the only letter we have from the Baal Shem Tov. There's one other one, but it's not conclusive that it was from him. Okay, this is the letter to his brother-in-law Gershon of Kutov, where he writes it somewhere around 1750. This is Yaakov Yosef of Polna saying how he received the letter. Okay, here's where it starts, as far as I know. Oh, did something wrong. Very good stuff. Okay, hold on. Where does it start? My beloved brother-in-law, my friend who is dear to me, the exalted rabbi and chassid. The chassid means saintly person, renowned for his Torah scholarship and fear of heaven, our master Abraham Gershon, may his light shine. And his family and his modest wife Bluma, together with their children, may they be blessed. I received the letter written by your holy hand, which you sent by the means of an emissary from Jerusalem. He was in Jerusalem, at the fair of Lucca in 1750. It was written with extreme brevity, explaining that you have already written at length. Okay, I'm going to jump over this. Oh, by the way, this is interesting. You might remember that the letters never arrived, and I was sorely grieved because I never saw the work of your holy hand, meaning there was a letter that he didn't get. This must be due to the calamitous state of many lands in which the plague has spread. The plague, of course, is, how do you say the plague in Romanian?
Plaga.
Plaga.
Plaga, yeah. So at that time, there was a plague that was spread from many lands. Not far from our region, the pestilence has reached the holy community of Molev, also Wallachia, and also Turkey.
Excuse me, but I think here the sense is tumor at plague.
Which one?
The sense of plague is tumor in Romanian.
Oh, okay. There's also pestilence, which, yeah. Okay, I'm going to jump over now. On Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year, 1746. Now here he translated Kabbalistic oath. It's not an oath. It's a bad translation. Hashba'ot means to mention names of angels. It's just called an oath. You're actually making the angels take an oath. But what he did was he used secret names of God. And I elevated my soul in a manner known to you. Meaning I did use certain names of God to have an ecstatic experience, what we call in research, in a manner known to you, which means I have discussed this before. I saw wondrous things in a vision, like of which I have never witnessed since the day my first mind came to awaken. The things that I saw, and I learned when I ascended there, would be impossible to communicate, even if I were to speak to you in person. I returned to the lower Garden of Eden. I mean, there are levels. There's the higher Garden of Eden and the lower one. I saw many souls of the living and the dead, some known to me, others unknown. The number was beyond reckoning. There's just many of them, all these souls. For a hastening to and fro, wanted to ascend from one world to another through the column known to those who are initiated in the mysteries. Their joy was great, too great for the mouth to express and the physical ear to hear. Also, I saw many evildoers who were repenting. Their sins were being forgiven. It was a special time because it was right before the new year. Divine favor. Even to me, it was amazing how many of them were accepted as penitents, a number of whom you also know who these people were. There was a great joy among them too, and they ascended the column in the same manner. Together they begged and they implored me, and me unceasingly. And they said, because of the glory of your Torah, God has granted you an additional measure of understanding to know these matters. Please ascend with us so you can help and support us. And all these souls were turning to him to help them. Because of the great joy that I beheld, I agreed to go up with them. And I was looking for my master to accompany me, for the ascent to the supernal worlds is fraught with dangers. From the day of my birth until now, I never experienced such an ascent as this. I went up from level to level until I entered the palace of the Messiah, where the Messiah studies Torah with the Tanaim and the Tzaddikim. Tanaim are the rabbis of the Mishnah. The Tzaddikim are the righteous people, and the 7 shepherds. The 7 shepherds are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, Joseph, David. Then I found I found extremely great rejoicing, and I do not know what the cause of this delight was. At first, I thought that it might be due to my being passed away from the physical world. God forbid. Later, they told me that I had not yet died, for they had great pleasure on high by mystical unifications of God's name in the world below. However, to this day, the nature of their joy remains to me unknown. Then I asked the Messiah, when are you going to come, sir? And he replied, by this you shall know. It will be a time when your teachings become popular and revealed to the world, and your well springs have overflowed to the outside. And it will be that which I have taught you and which you have perceived, others too will be able to perform mystical unifications and a sense of soul like you. And all the evil will be destroyed, and it will be a time of grace and salvation. I was amazed at this, but also greatly troubled. Since a long time must pass for this to be possible, how could it be that everybody's going to do things like this? But while I was there, I learned 3 holy names, which are easy to learn and explain. My mind was at ease, and I thought that these teachings, the people of my own generation might attain the same spiritual level as myself if they understood these teachings. They would be able to elevate their souls and learn and perceive just as I do. However, I was not granted permission to reveal this during my lifetime. I pleaded for your sake to be allowed to teach you, but I was denied permission. I had to take an oath to that effect. Okay, I think that's enough for the moment. The letter of the Baal Shem Tov. I want to point out is the Baal Shem Tov was definitely a mystic who was really interested in the internal life of a spiritual person. And he had techniques, which is just like in the 13th century, Abraham Abulafia had techniques of astral ascent, of how to feel an elevated soul. He had techniques too. It's hard to know where he learned the techniques from. We know that there were others in the Carpathian Mountains of other religions who also practiced techniques of elevation of soul. So this is not unusual, but of course, he's explaining in a Kabbalistic way of the techniques that he used, even slightly different than Abraham Abulafia. So how does this connect to the Hasidic movement? It's an interesting question. It's basically like this. The Hasidic movement was inspired by the Baal Shem Tov, but it wasn't started by the Baal Shem Tov. It was started by his students, specifically Jacob Joseph of Polna and the Maggid of Mezrich, whose name is Dov Ber of Mezrich. These are the ones who are the most instrumental in starting the Hasidic movement. What was the Hasidic movement of the 1740s and 50s, which spread like wildfire after the death of the Baal Shem Tov after 1760? I'll try to explain this very quickly. Before the Baal Shem Tov came around in the 17th century, we have many difficult times for the Jews of Poland. One of them maybe you heard about were the Khmelnytsky massacres, 1648 to 1658, if I remember correctly. The Khmelnytsky massacres, Khmelnytsky was the head of Polish mercenaries who were employed by the Polish government to fight the Turks, the Ottoman Empire. And they do so, but the Lithuanian Polish government was a little stingy and they underpaid them poorly. And Khmelnytsky decided to teach them a lesson, and he got together with his soldiers and they started fighting the government. Because the Jews were identified with the barons, because of the fact that Jews were protected by the barons, and the Jews also very often were tax collectors on behalf of the barons because they didn't own land, and sometimes they couldn't afford to have shops. So that was one of the things they used to do. So it created a lot of animosity. And during these uprisings, which took years, tens of thousands of Jews were killed. Some people estimate 30,000, some people go as far as 80,000, but tens of thousands of Jews were killed in the Polish-Lithuanian Empire by the Khmelnytsky gangs that were mercenaries that revolted against the Polish government. Then, of course, you had the Polish-Swedish War, and you had other things that happened. Very often the Jews were caught in the middle. You also had this false messiah of Shabtai Tzvi, Sabbatianism, which also happens just after the Khmelnytsky massacres, because the Jewish world was looking for some breath of fresh air, a little bit of a light of hope in such difficult times. And then, of course, Shabtai Tzvi turned out to be a false messiah, and all the hopes were ditched. And so the Jewish world of the 18th century is still living under the shadow of that difficult period. Just like today, 75 years after the Shoah, the Jewish world is still living in the shadow of the Holocaust of the Shoah. Something like that was the world that Israel Baal Shem Tov entered as a young man. When he was born in 1700 and then the 1720s, people were still living under the shadow of these difficult times and the massacres of Jews in Poland. So people needed something to give them hope. The Hasidic movement was there to create hope. In what way? In Jewish society, in traditional Jewish society, most people didn't have the luxury to study Torah. You see, there was no, it's only after Napoleon where you have free education. And it's only in the 20th century where you have governments who will support people who don't have work, or who are invalid, handicapped, or doctors and free medicine. All this didn't exist. So basically in Jewish society, like in many societies, as soon as you got to the age of 13, 14, you went out to work in order to support the family. So if a child, in Jewish society, children would study until the age of 13 in a school which was usually in the synagogue. We called it a cheder, which literally means a room. There would be a room designated in the synagogue, and the children in the community would study there with a melamed, with a teacher. Now, these children would learn the Hebrew language. They would learn also maybe read and write Yiddish. They would learn the Bible with usually the commentary of Rashi of the 11th century. They would also learn a little bit of Mishnah, Jewish law, the Jewish prayer book, all the basics, I would say, until they were 13, until their bar mitzvah, when they were coming of age. That's it. After that, they would go out to work. The women, if they studied anything, was at home with their mothers. Now, the communities did need rabbis and cantors and teachers, etc. So how did they pick them? They would look to see which children were gifted. If a child by the age of 11 appeared to be gifted, or by 12, then the community would put money aside to support that child to learn for another 5 to 7 years in order to become a rabbi, or a scribe, or a teacher, or a lecturer, in the community, some type of position in the community. The larger the community, the more funding there was. The smaller community, the less they had. And this is it. You know, very often when you read the stories, the biographies of rabbis who lived in Eastern Europe in the 18th, 19th century, all the biographies sound the same. They say, by the age of 10, he knew the Bible back and forth. By the age of 11, he knew the Mishnah from the old tradition completely. By the age of 12, he could recite full tractates of the Talmud by heart. And I always say, I believe every one of these stories, because if these children were not child prodigies and gifted by the age of 12, the community would have not supported them. Okay, there might be slight exaggeration, but the point is they were gifted children, or else the community would have not wasted their funding, which was very scarce. So most people who were not from rich families and couldn't support themselves to study after the age of 13, what they knew is what they knew, and that was it. They could come to the synagogue on the Sabbath and listen to a lecture, maybe study a little bit of the Perikopa of the week with the rabbi, maybe study a little bit Jewish law or the Talmud or Midrash, but you know, it was very limited. If you wanted to know something, you would ask the rabbi, or maybe you could figure it out by yourself in a book. The Chassid, but you see, already the Mishnah says Talmud Torah keneged kulam. The study of the Torah is the greatest mitzvah, the greatest command. Because through the Torah, you're studying the Word of God. So it was understood in Jewish life that those who studied Torah were on the highest level. But where does that leave everybody else? The Hasidic movement wanted to address that problem. How do you explain to the average person that they can also get close to God? They don't know how to study Torah like the rabbi or the great scholar or the teacher in the yeshiva or even the teacher in the school for children. So what are they going to do? The message of the Hasidic movement in the early years, in the middle of the 18th century, was that if you pray to God with intent, with devotion, with fervor, with enthusiasm, with your heart, that can bring you to the highest spiritual levels, just like any great scholar. If when you do God's commandment, you do it through happiness and devotion and faith, that is like a rocket. It takes you right up. These were the messages of the Hasidic movement. Come to the synagogue, pray with fervor, dance around, sing, be happy in your lot. You know, it's interesting, you have charismatic Christianity, which sort of, in that sense, I guess, connects to the same type of idea, right? Do things, I don't know a lot about it, but I've read a little bit about it. So the Hasidic movement was that type of a movement. It was for the general populace to let them understand that God wants the heart. And so no matter who you are, you can become close to God in the ways that you know how. So you're not a great scholar, but you can pray. You're not a great scholar, but you can keep the festival of Passover with great devotion. You could keep the Sabbath and be happy about it. Lots of things you can do. I'll tell you a famous Hasidic story, which is associated with the Baal Shem Tov. A lot of these stories were told much later, but it explains the way the movement sees itself. Whenever there's a story about the Baal Shem Tov, it explains how the Hasidic movement saw itself. The story goes, it was Yom Kippur, the holy fast day in September every year, Yom Kippurim. And in the city of Medjibush, the whole community was there in the synagogue, and the Baal Shem Tov was sitting at the front. And everybody was praying with great fervor, and the cantor was singing at the top of his voice. And in the afternoon, the door opens of the synagogue and a young boy walks in wearing his work clothes and sort of sits at the back of the synagogue and watches everybody for a while. Okay. Then he decides to say something. And he starts saying the alphabet of the Hebrew alphabet, one after another. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. And he's screaming it at the back of the synagogue. And people are getting very upset. This is the holiest day of the year, and you have nothing better to do than disrupt it. So somebody walks over to him. They want to take him out of the synagogue. And the Baal Shem Tov says, no, I need to talk to him. So they bring the boy over to him. Baal Shem Tov says, tell me, son, what are you doing? What are you doing there at the back of the synagogue? So the boy says, look, I'm a shepherd. That's what I do. I watch cows, I watch chickens, I watch sheep for other people. I don't know how to speak Hebrew. I tried opening up the prayer book. I didn't really understand what it said. But I know that today is Yom Kippur. And it's a very holy day. And I want to be part of it. So I said, God, you know that I don't know Hebrew. But you know what's in my heart. So here are the letters of the Hebrew language. You put them together, because you know what I want to say. The Baal Shem Tov said that was the best prayer of the whole day. This was the idea of the Hasidic movement. The idea was simple people have the ability, they just underestimate themselves. This is a very powerful message. It was also a very necessary message for people who are still in the shadow of the destruction that happened to the Jewish communities just less than a century before them. They needed a new message. They needed something. There are other parts of the Hasidic movement, but I'm just saying this was like the part that grabbed the people. You could be close to the Rebbe, to the master, the Hasidic master, the Hasidic rabbi, and the Hasidic rabbis were not people who decided Jewish law. They were completely spiritual guides. I think there's a term for this in the Orthodox Church. You have certain priests that are considered more spiritual. Do you know what I'm talking about? I forget the term. What is the term?
Kalugar.
Oh, maybe, but I'm thinking
monk.
Which?
A monk.
No, not a monk. There's
monk.
term. There's another term. Oh my, I never remember.
Ascet?
No. It's considered somebody who has spiritual insights and not just knowledge of the law.
Illuminated.
It starts with a D, something with a D. Wow. I know that exists. I heard it from a student of theology that told me this, and I can't remember at the moment. If it comes to me, I will tell you.
In Christian Orthodox Church.
Yes. But both in Romania and in Ukraine, Russia.
Serbia, Bulgaria, so on. Okay.
I just can't remember it starts with a D, I think. But since I'm not familiar with these words, so I hear it sometimes. Yeah, maybe it'll come back to me. I'll try to find out. But anyhow, the idea of the holy man is not something which is unusual for this time period. Also, people want also to connect to religious people who they feel have a certain level of spirituality and not just knowledge. So I forgot it. Anyhow, I didn't think I'd be stuck about the Hasidic movement, so it didn't occur to me. Anyhow, so what was I saying? So this was the message that grabbed the people. The idea that you don't have to spend all that time studying Torah to reach these levels. In knowledge, yes, but not as in your relationship to God. And this was a very powerful message. I would say the Hasidic movement in Poland grew so immensely that by the end of the 18th century, you had tens of thousands of Jews who considered themselves part of this movement. By the early 19th century, it was probably even more than that. It was probably in the hundreds of thousands. Remember, the Jewish population grows slowly. By the end of the 19th century, where you have more people in world population and also in the Jewish population, I would say the Hasidic movement was definitely in the hundreds of thousands. Point. No. No, it's bothering me. Hold on. You know what? I'm going to look for it. Okay, so let's get back to this. All this was to explain a little bit about the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement becomes very popular. I don't want to talk about what the opposition. The opposition of the Hasidic movement was because it was a very popular movement, and there was fears that it would go overboard, that it would not remain Orthodox. Today, it's hard to understand that, but popular movements have the ability to fall out of line. Because of the opposition to the Hasidic movement in Lithuania at the time, it kept the Hasidic movement within the line, if you know what I mean. Because when you're constantly criticizing, so they have to explain that they're not the way you think. So because of that, the Hasidic movement remained within Orthodoxy. But in the early years of the Hasidic movement, because it was a very popular movement, they sometimes cut corners of certain things in Jewish law in order to accommodate the common people. It's not like that today, but it was like that in the 18th century. It was considered a very popular movement, a very liberal movement, meaning they kept Jewish law, but sometimes in a very liberal way, because when you want to be popular and you want to get to everybody, sometimes you have to slightly lower the bar. But the Hasidic movement develops over the generations, and today the Hasidic movement is considered ultra-Orthodox. And the funny thing, thank you, and the funny thing is that even the opposition of the Hasidic movement, the Lithuanians, are also considered ultra-Orthodox. So the ones that actually disagreed with each other, both of them are considered today the ultra-Orthodox community. What is similar about them when you look at them? That they're wearing black suits. That's the similarity. They wear black suits, they wear a black kippah and a black hat. The difference is the Hasidim, they wear the furry hats on the Sabbath. They wear a long kaftan also on the Sabbath, whereas the non-Hasidic or ultra-Orthodox would not. They'll wear a short jacket and black, but they won't wear the furry hat. They don't consider themselves part of the Hasidic world at all. The Hasidic world is much more insular than the ultra-Orthodox non-Hasidim. Much more insular. And a few other things about the ultra-Orthodox. As I said, the ultra-Orthodox world is really, so you have the Hasidim already before the emancipation, but the Hasidim before the emancipation are not wearing different garments only on the Sabbath. You understand what I'm saying? Even when they live in different communities in the 18th century, all Jews lived in different communities in the 18th century, because all Jews in Poland, Russia lived in certain areas. Especially when Russia took over Poland, Jews had to live in the Pale of Settlement. They were only allowed to live in certain areas. So that had nothing to do with the ultra-Orthodox world. It's just the way it was. Take the Jews of Transylvania. They all lived in their little towns or their little like small villages. Not very often you had Jews maybe in the big cities, but you had lots of Jews who lived in little villages because they found it easier to keep Jewish life that way. So it was the same in really in most of Eastern Europe, in Russia and Poland, where Jews, when they wanted to keep the traditions, it was just easier for them when they did not live in the big cities. There are also places Jews were not allowed to live in the big cities. In Russia, until the 20th century, till the revolution, Jews were not allowed in Moscow or in St. Petersburg. Only after the revolution were they allowed in. Weren't allowed in universities till then. So what I'm saying was, but what the difference is in the Hasidic communities, they decided voluntarily to remain in insular communities even after the non-Jewish world accepted them within their cities. They actively looked to live by themselves. Other ultra-Orthodox Jews want that too because they want to have enough community around to support their way of life. But they will do it within the large city, though. In the 20th century, a lot of the Hasidim also live in large cities, but they will do it, they will be very insular. They will have whole streets of their people, one after another, so that they feel that they're together. The modern Orthodox, by the way, will not out of Israel. They'll live in different places. They'll live near the synagogue and near, because they have to walk there on the Sabbath. And relatively close to where there's a good school for their children and a place they can buy kosher food. But they won't necessarily look to be in insular communities. They might not even like that. Okay? Also, modern Orthodox will go to university. Ultra-Orthodox will not. Whether Hasidic or non-Hasidic. There's always exceptions. But in general, the ultra-Orthodox communities frown on the university because they're afraid, what are they going to teach you there? They don't frown on somebody who's looking for work. Like they understand if you have to be a doctor, you have to go to university, but you won't find Hasidic doctors normally who went to university unless they were newly religious Jews, meaning who became Hasidic later on in life. You won't find people who grew up in Hasidic communities who went to universities to be doctors and lawyers. You will find some ultra-Orthodox Jews of the non-Hasidim who will do that, but they'll do it in a very limited way. The women will do it more than the men, because the men have a mitzvah to study Torah, and the women don't necessarily. So you'll have more women who will go to university than men among the ultra-Orthodox, but not among the Hasidim. The Hasidim are much more insular than the other ultra-Orthodox. Whereas in the modern Orthodox, nobody has a problem with university. Okay. I would say the main things that are different between after the emancipation by today, the main difference is, let's say, between the ultra-Orthodox and the modern Orthodox today, about three different issues. As I said, one is a relationship to modernity, because the ultra-Orthodox wants to be insular. It wants to keep its pace of life the way it was before. They want their grandchildren to look like their grandparents. Okay? That it looks more or less the same. But the life that was before is just transplanted to the new time. Is that possible? They will try as hard as they can. And that's one of the reasons why they live in insular communities. The second, as I said, so we have the insular community, the fear of modernity. Everything modern is held under suspicion, even if they incorporate it. The fear of secular sciences and knowledge in the universities that may bring people to doubts in faith. I would say those are the three things. In Israel, it's also the relationship to Zionism. The ultra-Orthodox officially are non-Zionists. Today, things have changed a little bit, but officially the ultra-Orthodox are non-Zionists, whereas the modern Orthodox in Israel are religious Zionists. They don't have a problem with it. So if you include the state of Israel, there are four issues, which are different between the modern Orthodox. And as you see, most of the issues are social, not so much about Jewish law. The insular community, which is ultra-Orthodox, the fear of modernity, meaning we hesitate, everything is under suspicion if it's modern. The fear of general knowledge, it should be taught by certain people. And in Israel, the the hesitance of being involved too much in Zionism or being considered Zionist. That's a more complicated issue because in the end of the day, the ultra-Orthodox did enter the Knesset, Israeli parliament, and did enter the governments, but it took them a long time to come to that idea. It was more the necessity that brought them to that than ideology. Okay, does that make sense? Are we? Yeah. So what? Okay. I slightly jumped forward, but let me talk a little bit about modern Orthodoxy in the United States, because that is the largest Jewish community today and in the 20th century outside of Israel. But one other thing, where does ultra-Orthodox begin? Because as I said, you have Hasidim and you have non-Hasidim living in Eastern Europe, Poland. Then from Poland, they make their way to the Ukraine, which was part of Poland. From there to Bessarabia, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Right, the Hasidic movement moves westward slowly. I would say it stops in Czechoslovakia, more or less. Much later in the 20th century, Chabad, Lubavitch will come to England, will come to France, to Belgium, but that's much later. In general, Western European Jews were not attracted to the Hasidic movement. So, but it's the emancipation which really creates ultra-Orthodoxy. It's the way what we call ultra-Orthodox is a reaction that starts in the 19th century. Because Hasidim did not start as people who were looking for an insular community. They just happened to live in these communities. It wasn't something they were actively looking for. Besides, the non-Jews didn't want them among them. So it was just de facto, that's the way things worked out. Jews used to live in the areas of town where there are other Jews. It was just easier. It was also a question of protection, meaning to keep yourself together, just in case you're attacked. In the 19th century, the question is how to see what's going on. You have assimilation, you have the emancipation where Jews can now do what they want. They can go to universities. You have the reform, which is a new attack against traditional Judaism. Samson Raphael Hirsch, who is considered the father of modern Orthodoxy because he embraces emancipation, embraces modernity, and also embraces secular studies, even though, by the way, he was non-Zionist, but he does die in 1880, so Zionism was just at the beginning in those days. Conceptually, he is the beginning of the insular community, because he did create an insular community for his group of Jews, of Orthodox Jews in Germany. However, the actual founder ideologically of today, what we call ultra-Orthodox, is Rabbi Moses Sofer, who lives in Pressburg. That's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Pressburg today, of course, is Bratislava. And his students become prominent rabbis in Hungary and in Transylvania, and some of them also in other parts of Romania. For a moment, just look at this. Moses Sofer, 1762 to 1839, is known by his work, which is called Khatam Sofer. It was a work in Jewish law. He established a yeshiva academy in Pressburg, in Bratislava, called the Pressburg Yeshiva. It was the most influential yeshiva in Central Europe, producing all the future leaders of Hungarian Jewry and Transylvanian Jewry. Yeshiva continued to function until World War II. I'll jump over all this. These are names of people who were influenced by him. Okay, I'm going to just say this. Okay, let me just explain this in a simple way. Moses Sofer was aware of what happened in Germany under Samson Raphael Hirsch, who had his own community, had his own insular community, Orthodox, as a reaction to the reform. And he decided to do the same thing in Pressburg. He was vehemently against the reform movement, that he was afraid it might come to Hungary. He did a little bit, you had Neolog, but it was a very moderate type of reform movement. And so aside from the attacking the reform, he also believed in the idea of this insular community. Today, many Haredi, meaning ultra-Orthodox Jews, will see the Chatam Sofer, Moses Sofer, as their patron and ideologue. Even among the Hasidim, who sort of adopted him, in a sense, even though he was not Hasidic. If anything, he was closer to the Vilna Gaon of those who opposed the Hasidic movement. So, so I would say ideologically, both the Hasidim and the non-Hasidim would have seen the Chatam Sofer in that sense as their ideologue. Just the non-Hasidim would have seen the Vilna Gaon more as their ideologue, and Chaim Volozhin, his student, than the Chatam Sofer. Whereas the Hasidim would have seen the Chatam Sofer in the sense politically. There was an attempt to establish an ultra-Orthodox movement. The first one was in 1871 in Hungary. Later on, in the 20th century, the movement was called Agudat Yisrael, which means the community of Israel. It was established mostly by Eastern European rabbis and German rabbis who were from the groups of Samson Raphael Hirsch. Not surprisingly, the German rabbis and the Eastern European rabbis from Poland didn't exactly see eye to eye, even though they both considered themselves ultra-Orthodox, because it really was a different way, different cultural settings that they were living in. But somehow they were able to get together and create Agudat Yisrael at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And by the way, Agudat Yisrael today has a party in the Israeli government of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel. The ultra-Orthodox community in Israel today is somewhere between around 8% of the country, at least of the Jewish population. It's about 8%. It's not very much. But then because they all live in certain areas, because they like being in the insular community, for instance, Jerusalem is probably the world center of ultra-Orthodox Jews. And then, of course, you have centers in different countries and also in different cities in Israel. Bnei Brak would be the second center. You have also little towns. We have ultra-Orthodox Jews, Kiryat Sefer and Beitar, and in the old city of Tzfat and a few other places. And also outside of Israel, you have in Antwerpen, you have in Brooklyn, a lot in Brooklyn. So getting back to this. So wait, what was I saying? I lost my train of thought. We were talking about the oh yes, in Israel. So out of Israel, as I said, you have in Williamsburg, you have in Strasbourg, you have in in Brooklyn, in Antwerpen, even in Paris, in Montreal, in Toronto. There are different cities that have ultra-Orthodox communities, and they tend to like living in their areas. In New York State, you have lots of them. You have in Muncie, you have in Monroe, you have, you can go from one to another. My niece, who lives in New York City, when she was like 12 years old, so my sister took her, they went to Brooklyn, and there's certain areas where everything's in Hebrew, and you see Hasidim, and she says, Mama, where are we? What is this place? It's like, so yeah, which is interesting. Okay. What else do I want to say? So as I said, the ultra-Orthodox movement is also a reaction to the emancipation. Before that, you have traditional and religious Jews, but they don't consider themselves one way or another, or even among the Hasidim, they didn't wear the garb every day. They only wore it on the Sabbath before the emancipation. After the emancipation, because they wanted to create a more insular group, they started demanding from the people to wear it all the time. Also among the non-Hasidic ultra-Orthodox, in the 19th century, nobody wore black. Until the Second World War, nobody wore black. They did wear suits when they went to the academies and on the Sabbath, but not necessarily black. It all happened after the Second World War, because it was the fear that the new world would not allow them to grow the way they want to. So even the non-Hasidic ultra-Orthodox took upon themselves black suits. It was almost like a uniform. It happened slowly. That's what I'm saying. So in general, the ultra-Orthodox, there's a certain reaction. One interesting thing about the ultra-Orthodox, and I think it's a very nice thing when you look from the outside, is because they're insular groups, they are very supportive. There's a lot of social support within these communities. If you have to have your children get married and you don't have money, you will have what we call gemachs, these loans, free loan societies. You can get a bride's dress. They'll find you a wedding hall. They'll have somebody who can sponsor the meal, and they'll find you a rabbi. You can, if you need it, they can find everything for free, because you actually have people who they spend their time running these free loan societies. And okay, it's also their job, but I'm just saying they have these free loan societies where almost anything. One of the biggest free loan society, which was established by an ultra-Orthodox Jew, and then eventually was taken over by the city here in Jerusalem, is called Yad Sarah. Yad Sarah, started by one of our mayors here, Uriela Polyansky, the only ultra-Orthodox mayor that Jerusalem had, is basically a free loan medical assistance center. They give you a wheelchair and you just bring it back. They give you anything, really, any medical equipment that you did not get free from the hospital, they will give it to you. It's really quite amazing. And you can give a donation if you can afford it. You can't afford it, you just give it back, and that's it. Called Yad Sarah. They have all up and down the country. They work together with the hospitals. If the hospital doesn't have a wheelchair, you go to Yad Sarah, they give you the wheelchair. If you need oxygen tank and the hospital doesn't have it, you go to Yad Sarah, they give you the oxygen tank. Right? You need a special bed because you can't move, and they have these special hospital beds, you'll get it from Yad Sarah. In other countries, sometimes they also have things like that, but it's usually under the government. Like in Montreal, they have this thing called the CLSC, that they will give you a hospital bed, if you're an elderly person, whatever. If you're younger, it might be harder unless you're considered officially handicapped. But in Yad Sarah, they ask no questions. That's the difference. So I'm just saying, because it's an insular group and they want to take care of their own, they establish many, many things which are also very good. And I have to say also to their, another positive thing is they do not differentiate. They don't only give to ultra-Orthodox Jews. They basically give to anybody who needs when it comes to these free loan societies. I wanted to point that out. Of course, if the person has the means, they might ask questions or things like that. But if they don't have the means, it won't be an issue. Okay. Oh wait, there are some questions here. I see. Oh, no problem. Oh, it's already. I'm sorry. I already went over the time. Okay, so let me just summarize now. Didn't realize the time. So as I said, I would say there are 3 to 4 main things which are different between modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, what we call in Hebrew Haredi, which means the tremblers, the God-fearers. One of them has to do with the insular society, which is the Haredi community adopted after emancipation. In some places, it was natural for where the Jews were living. In some places, in the larger cities, it was something they actively pursued. It was the fear of modernity. Anything modern is under suspicion. The hesitance of secular studies. They wanted just to study Cheder and Yeshiva and Torah, and that's it. Whereas I said, the modern Orthodox had no problem with emancipation, don't necessarily look for insular societies, do believe in secular studies, etc. And the relationship to the state of Israel, where the modern Orthodox embrace the state of Israel much quicker than the ultra-Orthodox, but the ultra-Orthodox are coming around slowly. The non-Hasidim quicker than the Hasidim, but they are coming around slowly in their own way. They still hesitate about sending their boys to the army, but that could happen if it wasn't for the opposition that they keep hearing from the secularists. You understand what I'm saying? Sometimes when you criticize somebody too much, they don't want to do it. Sometimes you have to just stop the criticism and have private talks. But unfortunately, in politics, nobody likes private talks. Everybody goes to the extreme. Everybody makes up narratives that don't even exist. And unfortunately, it's very hard to solve problems that way. Most of the problems on the state of Israel today could be solved in 24 hours if there were no politicians. I've been living here for a long time. Yeah. Definitely among the Jews, in my opinion, even among the Arabs. But when you have groups that fight each other, it's very hard to accomplish anything. Because what happens is the groups who fight each other did start for good reasons. I'm not saying that they have bad reasons, but they spend most of their time fighting each other instead of promoting practical ideas. That's the problem. I think that's a problem in every country. Yeah. What else? As I said, probably the definition of an Orthodox Jew, and this is equal both to the modern Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox, is basically the fact that they believe in the 13 principles of Maimonides when it comes to faith. And in practice, they would consider the Code of Jewish Law of Joseph Caro and Moses Isserlich as the most important document in defining what Jewish law is and Jewish custom, with, of course, things that were added after that. Okay, I hope this was helpful in explaining this, and I wish everybody buonasera and